Graham, you wrote this book called Rebuild, The Economy, Leadership, and You. You have a depth of experience in business and economics. Just share a little bit about some of what brought you to this book and what you hope to this book kind of serves in terms of community building in the world.
So in brief, what brought me to this book is I went to a Rethinking Economics conference in London, and Jack Reardon gave a talk, and I asked him a question, namely, what impact does the stage of development, the maturity, the wisdom of economists have on economic thinking? And Jack found that a very intriguing question. So we started talking after his lecture as well. And we then continued talking until about 11 o'clock that night and continued talking the next day. And we realized, well, him as a professional economist, me as a former physicist and businessman, we really need to write a book that spans everything from each individual's inner developmental journey all the way through to macroeconomics and the foundations of economics as a discipline, because there's so much richness that's sparked off between us. So that was the journey to the book.
Thank you so much, Graham. Maybe we could dive in on a part that has spoke to me is the FairShare Commons idea and just the spectrum of types of incorporation structures and how do you align stakeholders and interests. Maybe you could speak a little bit to your business background and then some of the gradations that you talk about in the book.
Yes. Well, if I may, I'll take a little bit of a run up into answering your question. So the journey started for me when I was still working with Procter & Gamble and asking myself the question, why is it that P&G's purpose is to improve the lives of the world's consumers, and yet so many of our decisions are driven more by smooth quarterly returns to the investors? Left P&G saying we have to do something about the climate in 2008, and asking myself, like a good engineer, the 5 whys, why, because, and started coming to the conclusion it's because we're not understanding what the company is. And there were some seminal points in my journey that led to what is now called the FairShares Commons. One of them was, what are the roots of the word company? It's from the Latin com panis, with bread. A company was the original intentional community of people bonding together to share resources because they could survive and thrive better. So, right, a company is an intentional community. Then thinking to myself, well, what happens when you buy or sell companies? What you're actually doing is buying and selling the people in them, the relationships, the supplier relationships, the customer relationships. And oh, wait a minute, the company is called a non-human person. And the UN definition of slavery is the application of any or all of the concepts of property to a person, not distinguishing between human or non-human persons. And that was for me that, oh my God, insight moment of the company is explicitly declared as a person. That's what gives it the right to contract and things like that. And yet we treat it as if it was property. We have to really make explicit that the company is an intentional community and has to be a free person. The next big insight, I was born in Africa and grew up in South Africa. And the heart of apartheid is, if you have a white skin, you get the voting rights, control the country, control how the wealth is distributed. And that was the next big aha moment. The way we build the company, this is what enables us to treat it as property. Because if you have money to invest, you get all of the governance rights, you control what happens to the company, you control how the wealth is distributed. So it struck me, this is not malicious what's happening. This is just a natural consequence of human nature and building companies on an apartheid-like basis where we exclude all but a narrow set of interests from governance. Yeah, and no wonder it's so hard to build for-purpose companies, conscious capitalism or everything else that requires too much of people's ability to act according to larger values when they're in a game that is biased to play the game in a certain way. You know, it's a bit like we're asking people to not bang into each other and yet insisting that they play American football. So that's what led to what is now the FairShares Commons, where I, step by step recognized that many of the solutions were in Elinor Ostrom's understanding of what makes a highly functioning commons, in particular that everybody who is benefiting from the commons is also part of governing the commons and has an obligation to steward the commons. And then factoring in as well things like, well, a commons obviously cannot be owned, it cannot be bought and sold. And even more, the people who are part of a highly functioning commons recognize that they are actually caretakers of the commons for future generations. And so that's then what led into our FairShares Commons company, is seeing the company as an intentional community, not just the employees, but beyond the employees, all of the stakeholders, including the next 7 generations, including nature, that all of these stakeholders have governance rights. All of the stakeholders have a share in the wealth generated. So it's designed to distribute wealth equitably across all of the stakeholders. It's also a multi-capital incorporation because nature has a voice representing the natural capital invested in economic success. The next 7 generations have a voice. Where appropriate, the village or the town that the company is embedded in, representing the social capital and the infrastructure capital of that city, has a voice. And it's one of the beauties, to digress slightly, of this. I had a wonderful conversation with an American a few years ago when he was interviewing me. And he said, Graham, this is really intriguing because it sounds like you end up with very light need for regulation, that this would appeal to the libertarian end. And I said, absolutely. There's almost no need to tax these companies because the state may be a stakeholder with rights to dividends and capital gain. So you don't need to tax the company. You don't need regulation because everybody is in the company governing from within. It removes all of this adversarial game that we've built in, puts everybody into the tent, and they can have their fights in each company rather than via the courts and things like that. And so that then led to us developing a 3-dimensional model for business, each dimension going from 0 to 5. The one dimension being how it's incorporated, which is the dimension of how do stakeholders as categories of people and capitals interact with each other. The other dimension is organization design. How are roles, tasks structured to govern the work that's being done? And the third dimension is the human dimension. How are we as human beings in there, and how do we interact with each other as human beings? That's the dimension where spirituality has its place and can really show up in full power. And so on the human dimension, it goes from 0, individual humans as a resource to be mined and harvested, exploited, all the way through to 5, where development of the human as a being is an integral purpose of the company, equal in rank to any other purpose. On the work dimension, again, 0 to 5, where 5 is where the company itself in its operations, its work is truly alive. It has autopoiesis. In other words, the company can recognize when is it time for the company to decide to have offspring, to get married to another company, or no, I've come to the end of my life. It's now time to hospice myself. So it's not the investor's decision to shut the company down. It's the company's decision, and that's informed by all of the stakeholders speaking on behalf of the company as a commons. And that requires the vertical axis where 0 is your traditional limited company, 1 is a company that is employee owned, 2 is a cooperative. And you see, as we're going up the axis, the company is taking steps towards being able to follow its own purpose and fully enabled to do that. 3 is an intermediate stage where that's your full purpose companies, your well-structured public benefit corporations, all of those. 4 is the fair shares minus the commons, and that's still treated as property, more or less, and the emphasis is on wealth distribution and control distribution. And then 5 is just that little bit extra of adding in the essence of the commons, which in the language of spiral dynamics, for example, tips it over into second tier. Or you could think of that as now truly setting up the company to be what we've always needed it to be, but never allowed it to be.
So beautiful, Graham. Thank you so much. Just want to, as a final question, Evolute 6, people can read your book to get deeper into this question and others. We didn't even capture some of the dimensions on leadership or our own energy economy reflections you have. If people want to engage with your community, this conversation, what are some ways to plug in?
So the one way to plug in is to head off to your local online bookstore and order yourself a copy of the book. The other ways of plugging in is to contact us via our website. We run various programs to deepen understanding of this. We are running a venture studio and conversion program for individuals who want to work in startups like this, and for existing companies that want to transform. And we also run workshops on one key aspect of the book, which unpacks a huge mistake economists have made mathematically that has led economists to mistakenly believe that 100% competition is the ideal strategy. When you use the correct maths, you discover that just as nature does, a blend of competition and collaborative resource pooling is the optimum strategy. And that's one of our big emphases.
Thank you so much, Graham.